The truck was parked at the far edge of the lot, away from everything else, the way it always seemed to end up. Around it sat a tidy row of leased SUVs and clean sedans, the kind people wash before a wedding. And then there was the truck, green and white, a little faded on one side, a family name across the door in lettering that hadn't changed in 50 years. No slogan, no phone number in some clever font, no website, just the name, and underneath it, in smaller letters, the word that made people at parties take half a step back. Septic. Inside the venue, the reception was warm and loud and lit like a magazine, and near the edge of it, in a rented suit that fit almost right, stood a man named Marcus. He was holding a drink he wasn't really drinking, nodding at conversations he wasn't really in. He had a way of standing slightly apart from a crowd. He'd had it his whole life. You learn that posture early when you grow up as the kid whose family does the thing nobody wants to talk about. He could have told you the exact moment he learned it. 3rd grade. A birthday party he wasn't invited to, and the careful, polite way the other mothers explained it later, without explaining it at all. There was a smell people imagined when they heard his last name, even when there was no smell at all. Kids pinched their noses when the teacher called roll. By middle school, he'd started mumbling what his family did for a living. By high school, he'd stopped saying it. The family that handled what came out of everyone's house did not get a seat at the nicer tables. That was just the arrangement. Unspoken, but understood by everyone. So Marcus stood at the edge, and he let the evening happen around him. And nobody in that room had the faintest idea who he actually was, which was exactly how 3 generations of his family had always liked it. Here's the part they didn't know. A few months before that wedding, Marcus had sat in a small office across a desk from a man in a quarter-zip sweater, the kind of office with bad carpet and a coffee maker that had seen better decades. The family's accountant was there too, an older woman who had handled their books since before Marcus could drive. There was a single sheet of paper on the desk, face down, and the man in the sweater turned it over and slid it across, slow, the way you hand someone news. The camera, if there'd been one, would not have shown you the number. It would have shown you Marcus's face, the long pause, the way he looked at it, then looked up, then looked back down again, like the paper might say something different the second time. It did not say something different, because the family nobody invited to parties, the family people were just slightly embarrassed to stand next to. The family with the faded truck and the name that made people wince was worth $8.5 million. Not on paper in some imaginary someday way, real. Trucks that were paid off and running. Land they owned outright. A piece of property the entire county quietly depended on and almost nobody knew existed. Houses bought one at a time over the years, with cash that mailed in rent every month like clockwork, and a business that had been printing money, slowly, unglamorously, for half a century. The man who pumped your septic tank could have bought the house you threw the party in. And the strange thing, the thing Marcus kept turning over in his head, was that none of it had been a secret on purpose. They never hid it. They just never mentioned it. Because the same thing that made them rich was the same thing that kept them off every guest list in town. People didn't want to think about the work, so they didn't think about the family. So they never looked closely enough to notice what the family had quietly built. It started with one man, one used truck, and a phone that rang during dinner. Marcus's grandfather, Walter, back in the early 60s, looking at something nobody else wanted to look at. Everybody else saw a dirty job. Walter saw something underneath it, something he could not unsee, and it would take 3 generations to find out just how much it was worth. To understand what Walter saw, you have to understand what the early 60s looked like out where he lived. The county was growing. New houses were going up at the edges of town, out past where the city sewer lines reached, and every one of those houses needed a place for its waste to go, so they put in septic tanks. A tank in the ground, a field beside it, a system that quietly did its job until one day it didn't. Walter noticed something simple about those tanks. Something almost too simple to seem important. They filled up. Not once. Not as a one-time problem you solved and forgot. They filled up on a schedule, every 3 to 5 years, for as long as the house stood and someone lived in it. It didn't matter if the economy was good or bad. It didn't matter who was president. It didn't matter if the family inside was rich or broke. The tank did not care. The tank filled up, and somebody had to come empty it. Or life inside that house got very bad, very fast. Walter had spent years working other men's jobs, watching other men own the thing he was being paid to do. And somewhere in there, he did the math that most people never bother to do. He realized that pumping a septic tank wasn't a sale. A sale is something you have to win over and over, convincing a new person every time. This was different. This was a thing people were forced to call about. On a clock the ground itself was keeping, whether they liked it or not, and almost nobody wanted to be the one who showed up to do it. That last part was the whole opportunity. Because the work was unpleasant, the competition was thin. Because the work was embarrassing, nobody's bright kid was lining up to take it. The very thing that made people wrinkle their nose was the thing keeping the field wide open. Walter looked at a job everyone avoided and saw a door nobody else was walking through. So he bought a truck, used, a vacuum tank on an old chassis, bought on terms he could just barely cover. The kind of purchase that keeps a man up at night doing sums he already did twice. And he started showing up. Now, the numbers back then were modest, and I want to be honest about that, because this is where these stories usually start lying to you. Walter was not getting rich in year one. On a good day in those early years, he might run a handful of jobs. Each one brought in a fee that, by itself, was nothing to brag about. Out of that came his fuel. Out of that came the cost of dumping what he'd collected at a proper site. Out of that came the slow bleed of keeping an old truck alive. And out of that came the wear on his own back, which was a cost too, even if it never showed up on paper. What was left over was not a fortune. It was a living, a decent one, but a living. The money was not the lesson. The structure was, because here's what Walter was actually building, and he may not have even had the words for it yet. Every house he serviced went onto a list, and every house on that list was going to call him again. Not maybe, not if he marketed well. Again, on a schedule, because the ground demanded it. One pump out wasn't a transaction. It was the first payment in a relationship that would last as long as the house did. He wasn't earning a fee. He was acquiring a customer who came pre-installed with a reason to keep paying him for the next 30 years. The truck was the thing everyone could see. The list was the thing that mattered. And the list only grew. Because houses don't stop needing this. And new houses kept going up, and every single one came with a tank that would fill. At home, the phone rang during dinner, and it kept ringing. And the family learned something without anyone ever saying it out loud. The ringing phone was the income. Every interruption was money. Walter's kids learned to mumble what their father did when other kids asked. But they also never once went without. There was a quiet pride in the house, and a quiet shame right next to it, sharing the same table. And nobody knew quite what to do with either one. Walter died before he could explain any of it in plain terms. He left behind a truck, a name people made faces at, and a list of houses that would need pumping forever. His daughter inherited all of it, and at first, she wanted nothing to do with it. She wanted clean. She wanted respectable. She wanted out. Then she opened the books, and what she saw changed how she looked at everything. Diane was not supposed to be the one who stayed. That was the family expectation anyway. She was sharp, she was organized, she got good grades, and everyone agreed that meant she should go do something her father's name would never embarrass her in. Something with an office. Something with a title you could say at a dinner party without watching the other person's face change. So when Walter died and the business landed in her lap, she meant to clean it up, sell it off, and move on with the respectable life she'd been promised. She sat down at the kitchen table one night with a yellow legal pad and a shoebox of records and a pot of coffee, fully intending to figure out how to get rid of the whole thing. Instead, she read the books. Really read them. And somewhere around midnight, the thing she'd been embarrassed by her entire life quietly rearranged itself in front of her. Because here is what most people see when a septic truck rolls past. They see the smell. They see a man in coveralls doing a job they're grateful isn't theirs. They see the bottom of the ladder. That's the surface. That's the layer everyone looks at. And because they don't like what they see, they look away and they never look again. Diane started seeing the layer underneath. She saw a list of customers who were not customers in the normal sense because they could not leave. A homeowner can switch grocery stores. They can stop eating out. They can cancel almost anything when money gets tight. They cannot decide to stop needing their tank pumped because the alternative is sewage in the backyard. The demand wasn't a preference. It was a necessity wired into the physical reality of the house. Necessity doesn't shop around on price. Necessity calls whoever it called last time. Then she saw the map. Literally a map, with her father's accounts marked on it, and she noticed something he'd been doing by instinct without ever naming it. The jobs clustered. Whole neighborhoods, street after street, all on the same kind of system, all on the same rough schedule. And she did the math that changed everything. 2 trucks working tight, dense loops in the same few zip codes earned more, with less fuel and less wasted hours, than 4 trucks scattered all over the county chasing jobs an hour apart. The money wasn't in being everywhere. The money was in owning everything inside a circle you could service efficiently. She started calling it route density, though nobody had taught her the term. She just watched the numbers and let them tell her where the profit actually lived. And then she saw the deepest layer of all, the one that took her father's whole career to build, and that she almost sold without understanding. To do this work legally, you needed permits. You needed somewhere licensed to take what you collected. You couldn't just decide one morning to compete. The state and the county stood between you and the business, and the smell stood between the business and everyone who might have otherwise tried. Her father hadn't just built a list of houses. He'd built a position behind a wall that most people would never have the patience or the stomach to climb. That was the moment the shame fell off her like a coat she'd been wearing too long. She wasn't running a dirty job. She was holding a position no competitor wanted to fight her for. The shift was not really about septic tanks. It was about which layer of the world you train your eyes to see. Her whole life she'd looked at the truck and felt small. Now she looked at the same truck and saw an engine of recurring, non-negotiable, defensible income that the entire county was too squeamish to compete for. Nothing about the business had changed. Everything about how she saw it had. And once you start seeing the ownership layer, you cannot stop. She'd catch herself doing it everywhere. The laundromat down the street stopped being a sad room full of machines and became recurring demand from people without their own washers. The little parking lot by the courthouse stopped being asphalt and became a piece of land collecting money for doing nothing. She'd look at an ordinary business and find herself asking the question that changes everything. Who actually owns the thing underneath this? And how does the money really move? She stopped apologizing for the family name. She started answering the dinner party questions straight, watching the faces change, and not caring anymore. But the realization that kept her up the next several nights was bigger than any single truck or any single route. If one truck on one tight loop with one permit could throw off this kind of steady, stubborn cash, then it wasn't a job at all. It was a unit. And a unit, she realized, could be repeated. A unit could be repeated. That was the idea. Repeating it was the hard part, and it took Diane the better part of 3 decades, and it nearly broke her more than once. She started where anyone sane would. She took the cash the business threw off and, instead of spending it, she put it back in. A second truck. Then, a few years later, a third. Each one was the same bet her father had made, except now she knew exactly why it worked. More trucks meant more routes meant more houses on the list, and every house on the list was another customer wired to call again on a schedule she could count on. She wasn't gambling. She was buying more copies of a machine she'd already proven worked. But a truck doesn't drive itself, and this is where she learned the lesson nobody warns you about. The hardest part of the business was never the work. It was the people who did the work. A vacuum truck is simple. A man who's supposed to be in that truck at 6 in the morning and isn't is the thing that keeps you up at night. She lost operators to better-smelling jobs. She had one quit in a temper and spend a month telling half the county the family was impossible to work for. And she watched an entire route wobble because of one angry man with a phone. So she got better at it. Slowly. The way you only get better by getting it wrong first. She learned to pay a little above what the work seemed to deserve, because a reliable operator who stayed 5 years was worth more than 2 cheap ones who left. She built routines, schedules, a way of running things that didn't live only inside her own head. She turned a one-man instinct into something closer to a system that could survive any single person walking out the door. Then she did the thing that quietly multiplied everything. She started buying her competitors, not the big flashy way. There was nothing big or flashy about it. Out across the county were aging men exactly like her father had been, each running one or two trucks, each getting too old for it, each with a kid who wanted nothing to do with the family business. They had good routes, loyal customers, lists worth real money, and when they finally wanted out, they discovered something painful. Nobody wanted to buy a septic company. There was no line of eager buyers. There was, often, exactly one person in the whole county who understood what those routes were actually worth, her. So she'd meet them in a gravel lot or at a diner, and she'd buy the list, sometimes the truck, sometimes just the customers, for a price that was fair to a tired old man and a steal for a woman who knew what she was holding. Bolt those houses onto her existing routes, and the density got tighter, the profit got cleaner, and the wall around the whole business got higher. She wasn't beating competitors. She was quietly absorbing them, one handshake at a time. She used debt, but only one kind. She'd borrow against a truck, because a truck did guaranteed, scheduled work that paid the loan back on its own. She never once borrowed to look successful. There was no nicer house, no nicer car, nothing that the money went into that didn't make more money. When she finally bought the depot land instead of renting it, it wasn't a splurge. It was the same logic again. Own the ground under the operation. Stop paying a landlord. Control the thing you depend on. Later, when there was surplus cash, with nowhere urgent to go, she bought a few plain rental houses. Nothing to brag about, just buildings that mailed in money every month while she slept. And it was hard. I don't want to make 3 decades sound like a clean upward line, because it wasn't. A pump blew in the middle of January, and the repair bill landed the same week as payroll, and she sat at the kitchen table doing the kind of math that makes your stomach hurt. One acquisition turned out to be half-dead accounts, people who'd moved or died, and she ate the loss and learned to check the books harder next time. There were thin months. There was the particular loneliness of running something that was doing fine while you couldn't tell a soul, because how do you mention at a dinner party that the family nobody invites is having its best year ever? You don't. You just go home and keep going. By the time her son Marcus was a teenager, riding shotgun on summer mornings, watching his mother run all of it from a plain office with bad carpet, the family controlled something genuinely substantial. A fleet, layered routes across the county, the depot, the permits, a handful of rental doors, a couple of side services bolted on, the portable toilets and the inspections, each one its own quiet little stream of money. And the whole town still pinched its nose when they heard the name, still left them off the lists, still had absolutely no idea what was being built right under their noses, which, by then, was exactly the point. Marcus had a friend from high school. Let's call him Trevor. If you'd lined the two of them up at graduation and asked the whole town to bet on which one would end up rich, nobody would have picked Marcus. He was the kid whose family did that. Trevor was the other thing entirely. Easy smile, good clothes, the sort of confidence that fills a room before he does. Everyone agreed Trevor was going places. And for a while, it looked like he did. He got into sales, and he was good at it. The kind of good that comes with a real income attached. Then he became an entrepreneur, which is a word that can mean almost anything. He had a downtown condo with a view he'd point out to you. He drove a convertible, leased, though he didn't lead with that part. He wore watches that cost more than Marcus's first truck. He went to the right dinners, knew the right people, and his life online was a steady stream of wins, each one lit beautifully, each one shared. If you only ever saw the surface, Trevor was the success story. He was what the whole county pictured when it pictured a man who'd made it. And here is the quiet math underneath that picture. The same kind of math Diane had learned to do at a kitchen table. Trevor's income was real. It was also almost entirely spent. The condo was a payment. The convertible was a payment. The watches were depreciating the moment they left the store, and the dinners and the clothes and the whole performance of a rival cost money every single month and produced nothing. He earned a lot, and he owned almost nothing. His wealth was a thing he wore. And like anything you wear, it wore out and had to be replaced, constantly, just to stay convincing. The high income wasn't building anything underneath him. It was funding a costume he could never take off, because the costume was the whole asset. The day the income paused, the picture would too. That's the part people miss about looking rich. It isn't free. It's one of the most expensive things a person can buy, and it has to be rebought forever. And at the end of it, you own the receipts and nothing else. Now picture Marcus at the same age. He drove a pickup with a six-figure number on the odometer. He lived in a modest house in an ordinary neighborhood. And the house was paid off, fully, no payment. The deed sitting in a drawer. His clothes were work clothes. He did not post anything. If you saw him at the gas station, you would never, in 1,000 years, guess. You'd file him away as a guy who works with his hands, which was true and entirely beside the point. Because while Trevor was performing, Marcus was being. Behind that ordinary pickup sat a fleet of trucks that ran every day and were paid for. Land that was owned outright. Rental houses that deposited money into the account every month without asking him to do a thing. A business that, after 50 years of compounding, threw off more free cash in a quiet quarter than Trevor netted in a flashy year. Nobody was watching Marcus, and that was precisely why he was free. He didn't owe anyone a performance. He didn't have to keep being impressive. He'd inherited not just the assets but the discipline that built them, the family habit of letting the money stay invisible so it could stay working. There's a version of this story where Marcus shows up at the reunion, drops the number, and watches every face fall. He never did. The family never said, "I told you so." Not once, in 3 generations. They didn't need the room to know. The deposits knew. The deed in the drawer knew. When you actually have it, the hunger to prove you have it just quietly goes away. That hunger, Marcus came to understand, was the tax visible people paid for never having built the real thing. But I'd be lying to you if I said quiet wealth was free of cost. It has one, and it's just a different kind. The cost is that you carry it alone. You can't tell anyone. You sit at the dinner table while people pity you a little, and you let them, because correcting them would cost more than the pity does. You watch your kids get left off the list the way you were, and you decide whether to explain why or let them learn it the slow way you did. There's a loneliness wired into being underestimated on purpose. The family that nobody invited had built something extraordinary, and the price of building it quietly was that they had to hold it quietly too, every single day, for decades, with almost no one in the world to share it with. That was the trade. And Marcus had decided, long before that wedding, that it was a trade worth making. Then one ordinary afternoon, in a place as unglamorous as the work itself, the number finally arrived. The office had bad carpet and a coffee maker that had outlived 2 presidents. That was where it happened. Not a boardroom, not a glass tower, not anywhere you'd expect a number like that to land. Just a small room with a man in a quarter zip and the family's accountant, who'd known the book since Marcus was a boy, and a single sheet of paper turned face down on the desk. Marcus had asked for the valuation almost out of curiosity. There'd been a buyer sniffing around, a regional company that wanted the routes, and before he even considered it, he wanted to know, plainly, on paper, what 50 years had actually added up to. So the accountant ran it, and the man in the sweater turned the page over and slid it across, slow, the way you hand someone something heavy. $8.5 million. Here's how it broke down, because the number only means something if you can see the bones of it. The business itself, the trucks and the routes and the sticky, scheduled, never-ending demand was worth a few million on its own, valued the way you value any real business, on the steady earnings it produced year after year. The depot land was owned free and clear. The permitted disposal site, that quiet choke point the whole county depended on and almost no one knew existed, was worth more than anyone outside the family would have guessed. There were the rental houses, paid off, mailing in their monthly checks. There was the equipment. There was cash in the bank, because the family had never learned to spend it. No single magic asset, no windfall, no lucky break, no one moment it all happened. Just a slow stack of boring things, each one bought with the cash flow from the last. Each one repeated patiently across 3 generations. Walter's truck, Diane's routes, Marcus's discipline, half a century of a phone ringing during dinner. And Marcus looked at the number, and the number looked back, and he decided not to sell. Because selling was never the point. The point was never to cash out, take a check, and finally be allowed to look rich. The point was the thing itself, alive and producing, the way it had produced for his grandfather and his mother. You don't sell the machine that quietly prints the freedom your whole family chose over applause. He folded the paper, thanked the man, and drove home in the pickup with the six-figure odometer, past houses whose tanks he'd be servicing again in 3 to 5 years, on a schedule the ground itself was keeping. The truck is still parked at the far edge of the lot. The name on the door still hasn't changed. People still pinch their noses a little when they hear it. They're still not putting that family on the nicer lists. And the family still doesn't mind, because here's what 50 years taught them. And it's the thing I want you to sit with. Wealth is not always loud. We've been trained to think the two go together, that money announces itself, that you can read a person's net worth off their car and their watch and their feed. But the people performing wealth are often the ones with the least of it underneath, and the people who actually own the world tend to be standing quietly at the edge of the room where nobody's looking. The richest person in any space is rarely the one demanding you notice. The best assets are usually boring. Sometimes they're worse than boring. Sometimes they're the exact thing everyone else is too proud, too squeamish, or too status-conscious to touch. And that disgust is the wall that keeps the field empty and the margins fat. The smell everyone avoided was the moat nobody could cross. This family wasn't rich despite doing the job no one wanted. They were rich because of it. And maybe the deepest thing of all is what ownership does to how you see. Once Diane learned to look past the surface of that truck, she couldn't stop looking past the surface of everything. The laundromat, the parking lot, the dull little business on the corner you've driven past 1,000 times. There's an ownership layer underneath all of it, a place where the money actually moves, and most people go their whole lives never learning to see it. So here's what I'll leave you with. Somewhere near you, right now, there's a business everyone overlooks. A truck, a storefront, a service nobody brags about doing. Something a little boring, maybe a little beneath people, and someone, quietly, might be getting very wealthy from it while the whole town looks the other way. If this story made you see one of those differently, do me a favor and tell me in the comments. What's the boring business near you that you'll never quite look at the same way again? I read everyone.